Do you honestly believe that a hungry fish cares about a thin piece of string? For decades, old-school fishermen have sworn that if a fish wants to eat, it will eat, no matter what line you use. But what if I told you that in cold, crystal-clear spring water, your fishing line suddenly becomes 10 times more visible? Think about that for a second. You spend hundreds of dollars on the perfect, realistic lures. You wake up at the crack of dawn, you find the perfect fishing spot, and yet the fish swim right up to your bait, take one look, and turn around. Today we are going to expose a hard truth that ruins early spring fishing trips for thousands of guys every single year. I promise you, by the end of this video, you will look at your fishing reel totally differently. We are going to break down exactly why you are not getting bites when the water is freezing and clear. And I want to ask you right now, do you think fish are really smart enough to recognize fishing line? Or are fishermen just making excuses for a bad day? Let me know your thoughts down below, because we are about to tear this myth apart. Let us set the scene. Why is this topic so important right now? Every year, winter fades away, and we all get the itch to hit the water. But early spring fishing is notoriously difficult. The water is freezing, the fish are sluggish, but the most important factor is the water clarity. Without the heavy summer algae blooms, the lakes and rivers are often as clear as drinking water. Yet, so many of us grab the exact same rod and reel we put away last autumn. We use the same heavy braided line. We use the thick leaders. We do this because of habit. We do this because our grandfathers told us that fish do not have the brain capacity to care about fishing line. We have been conditioned to believe that durability is more important than stealth. We want to make sure we do not break off on a rock, so we use a rope. But times have changed. The waters are more pressured than ever before. Fish see hundreds of lures every single week. If you are stubbornly doing the same thing you have done for 20 years, and you are wondering why the guy next to you is pulling in fish while you get nothing, you need to hear this. The context here is simple. Clear water demands a completely different approach, and your heavy line is screaming danger to every fish in the area. Picture this scenario for a second. You wake up at 4 in the morning, the air is freezing cold. You grab your thermos full of hot coffee and head down to your favorite lake. It is the first real fishing trip of the spring season. You get to the bank and look down at the water. It is absolutely crystal clear. I mean, you can see every single rock and weed on the bottom. It looks like you are staring into a giant aquarium. You tie on your favorite lure, cast it out, and watch it sink. But then, nothing happens. Hour after hour goes by. You change baits, you change spots, still nothing. You start wondering if there are even any fish left in the lake. But the fish are there. They are just looking at your setup and laughing. Why? Because in that freezing clear water, your heavy fishing line looks like an absolute tow cable. This is a situation every single fisherman has faced. We blame the cold front. We blame the bait. We never want to blame our own gear. But the truth is staring right back at us through that clear water. When the water temperature drops, the suspended particles fall to the bottom. The clarity skyrockets. And when that happens, the rules of the game completely change. You cannot get away with the same careless rigging you used in the muddy water. Let us talk about the science of this clear spring water. During the warm months, water is full of life. It has algae, plankton and mud, stirred up by boat traffic. All of that acts like a camouflage net for your fishing line. But when winter hits, the water cools down drastically. All that algae dies off. The organic matter sinks deep into the mud. By the time spring rolls around, you are left with water that is completely stripped of its natural color. It is like turning on the bright lights in a dark room. Suddenly, everything is exposed. If you drop a shiny coin into that water, you can watch it flutter down for 20 feet. Now, imagine what your fishing line looks like in that environment. A thick, green, braided line which looked perfectly natural in the summer weeds, now stands out like a sore thumb. The fish are sitting down there in their natural habitat. They are used to looking for tiny, subtle movements of small baitfish. When your lure comes swimming by, pulling a thick, unnatural line behind it, it sets off alarm bells in their heads. They do not need to know what fishing line is. They just know that real minnows do not have a dark trail connected to their mouths. Now, where does this idea come from, that fish can see your line 10 times better? Is it just an exaggeration? Well, think about how light travels. In murky water, light scatters. It gets absorbed by the floating dirt. But in cold, clear spring water, sunlight penetrates deep and straight. There is nothing to diffuse the rays of the sun. This means that any object suspended in the water column is going to cast a distinct shadow and have a stark contrast against the background. Your fishing line is no exception. It is not just about the color of the line, it is about the contrast. If you are using a solid monofilament or a braided line, it blocks the light. To a fish looking up towards the sunny surface, your line looks like a solid black streak against the bright sky. So, when we say they can see it 10 times better, we are talking about that intense contrast. In muddy water, the visibility might be 2 feet. In clear spring water, the visibility might be 20 feet. Mathematically, that means your line is exposed to fish from 10 times farther away. They have more time to inspect it, more time to track it, and more time to decide that they do not want to eat your bait. Let us bust a massive myth right now. The old guys sitting on the dock will tell you that a fish has a brain the size of a pea. They say a fish cannot reason, so it cannot understand what fishing line is. And you know what? They are right about the brain size. A fish does not look at your line and think, "Oh, that is a 10-pound test line from a sporting goods store." But fish do not need to be smart to survive. They survive on pure instinct. Over millions of years, they have learned what their food is supposed to look like. A crawfish moving along the rocks does not drag a weird string behind it. A dying shad fluttering to the bottom does not have a rigid cable attached to its nose. When a fish sees your lure moving, its predatory instinct kicks in. It swims over to investigate, but as it gets close, that clear spring water allows it to see the line. The instinct tells the fish that something is wrong. The picture does not match the natural world. The fish feels that something is unnatural, and that feeling of caution overpowers the urge to eat. So they turn away. It is not intelligence, it is basic survival instinct, triggered by a visual warning sign. I want you to imagine yourself standing waist-deep in a freezing river. You are casting a small spinner for early-season trout. You are using a brightly colored braided line because it helps you see the bites. You make a perfect cast right behind a rock where you know a big fish is hiding. The lure spins perfectly, but you see a flash of silver and the fish darts away in panic. What happened? That braided line is the ultimate offender in clear water. Braid is fantastic for strength and sensitivity. It has zero stretch, but braid is completely opaque. Light cannot pass through it at all. In clear water, a braided line creates a solid, unbroken line of visual noise. Furthermore, braided line actually holds tiny air bubbles between its woven fibers. When you drag it through the water, those microscopic bubbles catch the sunlight and sparkle. You are basically dragging a tiny disco ball through the water. In muddy water, this does not matter, but in clear spring water, you are giving the fish a visual warning long before the bait even reaches them. If you tie your lure directly to a braided line in the early spring, you are sabotaging your own fishing trip. So, the natural reaction is to reach for fluorocarbon. Everyone tells you that fluorocarbon line is completely invisible underwater. The marketing companies print it in big, bold letters on the box. You buy a spool, tie it on, and assume you are suddenly a ghost. But let us have a real talk about fluorocarbon. Yes, it has a refractive index that is very close to water. This means light passes through it much better than regular monofilament. But completely invisible? That is a total lie. Nothing is completely invisible in clear water, especially when the sun hits it at the right angle. If you use a thick, heavy fluorocarbon leader, it will still reflect light. It will still create a visual distortion in the water. Think about looking through a thick piece of glass. The glass is clear, but you can still see the edges. You can still see the glare. That is exactly how thick fluorocarbon looks to a bass or a walleye in clear water. It is absolutely a better choice than braid, but you cannot just slap on a heavy 20-pound fluorocarbon leader and think the fish will not notice. You still have to pay close attention to the diameter of the line. This brings us to the most critical factor in clear water fishing: the diameter of your line. When the water is cold and clear, thin is always going to win. A thin line displaces less water. It blocks less light. It casts a smaller shadow. If you usually fish with a 12-pound test line during the summer, you might need to drop down to a 6 or 8-pound test line in the early spring. I know what you are thinking. You are worried about breaking off. You are terrified that you will hook the monster fish of a lifetime and the line will snap. That fear is exactly why so many fishermen struggle in the spring. You have to make a choice. Do you want to fish heavy and get 0 bites? Or do you want to fish light, get a ton of bites, and trust your drag system to land the fish? Modern thin lines are incredibly strong. If you set your reel drag correctly and take your time fighting the fish, you can land giants on a 6-pound line. In clear spring water, downsizing your line diameter is the single most effective way to drastically increase your chances of catching fish. It makes your presentation look natural. Let us talk about another sneaky way your line betrays you in cold water. It is not just about visibility, it is about how the cold affects the physical properties of the line. Cold water makes fishing lines stiff. Monofilament and fluorocarbon both become rigid when the temperature drops near freezing. This stiffness has a massive impact on your lure. Imagine tying a small, delicate swim bait to a stiff piece of wire. When you try to reel it in, the wire kills all the natural action. The bait moves like a block of wood. That is what thick, stiff line does to your lures in early spring. The fish in cold water are already slow and lethargic. They do not want to chase down a fast-moving meal. They want an easy target that looks exactly like a dying baitfish. If your thick line is killing the subtle, fluttering action of your bait, the fish will reject it. They might swim up and look at it, but the unnatural, stiff movement will turn them away. By switching to a thinner, more supple line, you allow the lure to move freely. You restore that natural, enticing action that triggers a sluggish spring fish to open its mouth. Think about a bright, sunny spring afternoon. The air is finally warming up. You take off your jacket. The water surface is completely calm, like a sheet of glass. This is one of the toughest times to fish. Why? Because of the sun glare. When the sun is high and bright, it illuminates every single particle in the water. It also hits your fishing line and creates a glowing effect. Even if you are using fluorocarbon, a bright sun can make it flash. Fish do not have eyelids. They cannot squint. When they look up at your bait, silhouetted against the bright surface, a glowing, flashing line is an immediate red flag. This is why many experienced anglers actually prefer to fish on cloudy, overcast days during the spring. The clouds diffuse the light and help hide the line. But if you are forced to fish in bright sunlight on clear water, you have to be extra careful. This is when you must use the lightest line possible. You should also try to keep your rod tip low to the water to minimize the angle of the line entering the surface. Every little detail matters when the sun is acting like a spotlight on your gear. Let us step into the mind of a cold water fish. Their metabolism is entirely controlled by the water temperature. In the summer, when the water is warm, their metabolism is through the roof. They are aggressive. They see a bait, they rush in, and they smash it without thinking twice. They do not have time to inspect your line. But in the early spring, when the water is barely above freezing, their metabolism is incredibly slow. They move slowly. They eat slowly. When you drag a bait past a cold water bass, it does not strike immediately. It will slowly follow the bait. It will swim right up behind it and just stare at it. This is the critical moment. Because the fish is moving slowly, it has all the time in the world to inspect your presentation. If you are using heavy line in clear water, the fish will see it during this inspection phase. It is like you are handing them a magnifying glass. They will stare at the lure, see the thick line attached to it, realize it is a trap, and slowly drift away back into the depths. You need stealth to beat a slow, calculating fish. We also have to consider fishing pressure. Back in the day, lakes were relatively quiet. But today, fishing is wildly popular. During the first warm weekend of spring, the boat ramps are packed. Hundreds of fishermen are pounding the same shorelines, throwing the same popular baits. The fish in these public waters are highly educated. They have seen every color of spinnerbait. They have heard every rattle. They have been caught and released before. These pressured fish develop something called line shyness. It is a real phenomenon. A fish that has been caught previously learns to associate the sight of thick, unnatural lines with danger. In clear spring water, this line shyness is amplified to the maximum level. If you roll up to a heavily pressured community lake with a thick braided line tied directly to a crankbait, you are wasting your time. The fish will scatter as soon as your lure hits the water. To catch pressured fish in clear water, you have to offer them a presentation they have never seen before. You need an ultra-thin, invisible leader that completely separates your bait from the rest of your heavy gear. What about the color of your line? Many of us buy dark green or blue monofilament because we think it blends in with the water. And in a murky river during the summer, a green line does blend in beautifully with the floating algae. But remember what we said about spring water. The algae is dead. The water is clear and colorless. If you cast a dark green line into totally clear water, you are basically drawing a dark line with a permanent marker across a white whiteboard. The contrast is terrible. Some guys try to use highly visible yellow or neon pink lines to help them detect subtle bites. This is a great strategy for the fisherman, but it is a disaster for the fish. If you can see the neon line easily from 30 feet away above the water, imagine how brightly it shines to a fish looking right at it from 5 feet away underwater. If you absolutely must use a high-visibility main line to watch for bites, you have to tie on a long, clear leader. The section of line closest to the bait must be as invisible and colorless as possible. Let us revisit the grandpa myth for a minute. You have probably had an older fisherman walk up to you, look at your ultralight spinning rod with 4-pound line, and laugh. He will tell you a story about how he used to catch giant limits of fish using a heavy nylon rope and a rusty hook. And the crazy thing is, he is probably telling the truth. But what he does not realize is that the environment has changed. 50 years ago, the water quality in many places was different. The fishing pressure was a fraction of what it is today, and the fish were far less educated. You cannot use tactics from 1970 to catch fish in a pressured lake today. The grandpa method worked because the fish were hungry, unbothered, and plentiful. Today, every single bite is a challenge. If you hold on to those old, stubborn beliefs that line visibility does not matter, you will spend your spring days just practicing casting instead of actually catching fish. Do not be afraid to break away from tradition. Embrace modern light lines and long fluorocarbon leaders. The results will speak for themselves. Now, let us talk about a major weak point in your stealth operation: the connection knot. You listened to the advice, you spooled up with braid for sensitivity, and you tied on a beautiful, thin, clear fluorocarbon leader. You think you are invisible, but you used a huge, bulky swivel to connect the two lines. Or you tied an incredibly sloppy, massive knot that leaves a huge lump of plastic in the middle of your line. In clear spring water, that bulky knot or that metal swivel acts like an underwater billboard. It catches weeds. It creates a weird wake in the water. It shines in the sun. A fish following your bait will absolutely notice a giant metal swivel spinning 2 feet in front of the lure. To truly master clear water spring fishing, you must learn to tie clean, low-profile connection knots. Knots like the FG knot or the double uni knot allow the lines to join smoothly without creating a massive visual distraction. Your stealth is only as good as your weakest link. Do not ruin a perfect fluorocarbon leader by attaching it with a clunky piece of metal hardware. Another scenario to think about is fishing with bait that sits perfectly still. Imagine you are fishing for spring trout with a piece of bait resting on the bottom. The water is incredibly cold and totally clear. Your bait is just sitting there. A trout swims up to inspect it. Because the bait is not moving, the trout has minutes, not seconds, to look at it. If you have a thick, stiff line holding that bait, it looks completely unnatural. The line might even be lifting the bait slightly off the bottom or pinning it down in a weird way. When a fish comes up to eat stationary bait, it often sucks water into its mouth to pull the food in. If your line is thick and stiff, it creates resistance. The fish feels the unnatural tension before it even closes its mouth, and it spits the bait right back out. In this situation, line visibility and line stiffness work together to ruin your chances. You need a line so thin and soft that it falls naturally to the bottom, becomes virtually invisible among the rocks, and offers zero resistance when the fish lightly sucks the bait in. Does depth matter when we are talking about clear water? Absolutely. The visibility of your line changes depending on how deep you are fishing. If you are fishing shallow water flats in the spring, the sun is hitting your line directly. The contrast is at its absolute highest. This is where you need to be the most paranoid about your line choice. But what if you are fishing deep? What if you are dropping a jig down to 30 feet? As you go deeper, the light fades. Colors start to disappear. The stark contrast of the line begins to blend into the shadows. In very deep water, even if it is clear, you can often get away with slightly heavier line because the lack of light provides a natural camouflage. However, remember that as you pull the fish up towards the surface, the light increases. If a fish is following your bait from deep water up into the shallow zone, they might suddenly spot the thick line as it enters the sunlight. It is always better to be safe and use a subtle leader, regardless of the depth you are targeting. Let us talk about the wind. Wind is a fisherman's best friend in the spring. When the water is completely flat and clear, it is like a mirror. The fish can see everything above and below the surface. But when the wind blows, it creates a ripple on the surface. That ripple breaks up the sunlight. It creates shadows and dancing light patterns underwater. It acts like a scrambling device for a fish's vision. If you have a choppy surface, you can actually get away with using slightly thicker line. The chaotic light patterns hide the solid silhouette of your fishing line. The fish are also less easily spooked because the noise of the waves masks the sound of your movements. So, if you are forced to fish in perfectly clear water, pray for a little bit of wind. Position yourself so you are casting into the wind or across it, taking advantage of the broken surface tension. But remember, the moment the wind dies down and the lake turns to glass, you need to switch rods and grab that ultralight setup. Are we just overthinking all of this? Are fishermen just crazy people who spend too much money on gear? It is a fair question. Sometimes we do overthink things. But consider the biology of a predatory fish. A bass or a walleye survives by being an elite hunter. Their eyes are specifically evolved to detect the tiniest anomalies in the water. They can spot a wounded minnow from a distance just by a slight irregularity in how it swims. If their eyes are that good, it is not overthinking to assume they can see a thick, bright piece of string tied to a piece of plastic. We are trying to trick a wild animal in its own home. In muddy water, we can be sloppy because the environment blinds the fish. But in clear spring water, we are fighting them on their terms. We have no environmental cover. It is man against nature, and nature has home field advantage. Paying attention to line diameter, color, and stiffness is not overthinking. It is just respecting the intelligence and the instincts of the animal you are trying to catch. So, what exactly do you need to change right now to stop getting skunked in the spring? First, look at the rod you are using. If your reel is spooled entirely with braided line, you need to add a leader immediately. Get yourself a spool of high-quality, low-memory fluorocarbon. Notice I said low memory. You do not want a stiff line that coils up like a spring. Cut off a length of that fluorocarbon. I recommend a leader of at least 6 to 8 feet in clear water. This ensures that the opaque braided line is far away from the lure. Tie a clean knot to connect them. Second, drop your line test down. If you normally use 12 pound, try 8 pound. The difference in diameter might look tiny to your human eyes, but to a fish, it is the difference between a tree branch and a spider web. Third, slow your presentation down. Give that thin, supple line a chance to let your bait move naturally. Let it flutter. Let it sit on the bottom. These simple adjustments take 10 minutes, but they will completely change your catch rate. Let us wrap this up with a final thought about the magic of spring fishing. Spring is a time of renewal. The fish are waking up from a long, cold winter. They are hungry, and they are preparing to spawn. It should be the best fishing of the entire year. But it can easily turn into the most frustrating time if you refuse to adapt. Do not let your stubbornness ruin a beautiful morning on the water. When you walk up to that bank and see water so clear you can count the pebbles on the bottom, do not groan. Do not pack up and go home. Embrace the challenge. Know that you have the right knowledge to beat the clear water curse. You know that visibility matters. You know that contrast is the enemy. You know that a thin, clear leader is your best weapon. Fishing is a game of constant adjustment. The anglers who catch fish consistently are the ones who change their tactics based on what the water is telling them. The water is clear, so make your line disappear. So, can fish really see your line 10 times better in cold, clear spring water? The answer is a massive yes. The lack of algae, the intense sunlight penetration, and the slow metabolism of the fish all combine to make your heavy gear stick out like a sore thumb. But here is the biggest plot twist. It is not just about the fish seeing the line. It is about how that thick, cold, stiff line completely destroys the natural action of your lure. When you downsize to a thin, high-quality fluorocarbon leader, you are not just hiding the string. You are freeing your bait to dance and flutter naturally, triggering strikes from fish that would otherwise just swim away. That is the secret that changes a terrible fishing trip into an unforgettable day. I want to thank you so much for watching and hanging out with me today. If this video helped you understand why your spring fishing has been tough, please hit that subscribe button right now. Leave a like to help the channel grow. And I want to hear from you. Head down to the comments and tell me, what is your absolute favorite brand of line to use when the water is crystal clear? Let us get a discussion going. Until next time, stay stealthy and tight lines.